Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. What if all Americans were required to vote? Would that be a good thing? Is it even feasible? Well, Australians are required to vote, and the system seems to work really well there. Turnout on Election Day in Australia is nearly universal. In their last major election, the turnout among registered voters was 92%. Compare that to just 60% in the United States. The authors of a new book called 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting, would like to see mandatory voting in America. I'll discuss the pros, cons, and the in-betweens of this proposal with a longtime master of public policy and one of the authors of the book, Miles Rapoport. Miles is a former president of Demos and of Common Cause, a former Connecticut Secretary of State, and now a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also a former boss and an old friend of mine. Miles, how are you? Good to see you.
Very good. Great to see you, Bob.
So this is an interesting book and a really provocative idea. And I didn't mention it in the introduction, but we'll mention it now. You've written it with a guy that I have tremendous respect for. So tell us how this whole thing came about.
Well, I have been a fan of E.J. Dionne's for many, many, many years.
Columnist for the Washington Post, and
right.
a long-time journalist, and his work is always of the highest standard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I actually read something that he wrote in 2015, making the case for universal voting. And it fascinated me. It's really what kind of got me into thinking about the policy as a whole. And then it turned out that he had a Harvard appointment at the same time that I did. And so I got up my
Harvard guys.
Well, he's a Fall River guy, anyway. So I asked him if he would co-chair a working group with me to really dig into it, and he said yes. And so that led to a report, which led to the book. And EJ, it was a fabulous partnership. I mean, we did 4 months of work on the book, never had a disagreement. It was just great.
So the term that you use in the title of your book is universal voting, but there's a lot of terms related to this idea. There's mandatory voting, compulsory voting, and a number of others. What exactly are you guys in favor of? And tell us how it would work in the United States.
Okay. We are in favor of redefining voting as not only a fundamental right, but also a universal civic duty, so that citizens are required to register and required to vote. It turns out, when we looked into it, that there are not just Australia, but 26 countries around the world that use it, and it's been extremely successful. Our view is that we'd like to see it enacted at the state and local level first, to kind of be the laboratories of democracy that Justice Brandeis talked about. But
so you would not have, you wouldn't be required to vote in national elections or presidential elections.
No, you would be. The states can set those terms.
Oh, the rules, it would be established state by state.
Yes.
I see.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And there's some real interest in it. So what happens in Australia, I'll use them for a model, is that there's a tremendous amount of public education letting people know how to vote. They make it really easy for people to vote, as you know. In some states, that's happening here as well. And then if you can vote anywhere on Election Day. Election Day is a Saturday.
What do you mean by anywhere?
Any polling place in the country. They're all linked together. So you can go to any polling place where you happen to be. Anyway, if you don't vote, if you're registered and then you don't vote, you get a letter in the mail saying, gee, Bob, we missed you at the polls. Can you give us a reason? And basically any reason you give, I was visiting my grandmother in Perth or whatever you want to say, is accepted. If you completely ignore it, they send you a second letter, and if you completely ignore that, you get a fine of 20 Australian dollars, which is about 13 US dollars.
So the penalties are not onerous?
No, it's what we call light touch enforcement.
If this were to come to pass in the United States, what kind of penalties do you imagine we might face?
Well, our recommendation in the book, obviously it would be defined state by state, by the legislators who are crafting the actual legislation. But our recommendation is a fine not to exceed $20, one that does not accumulate interest, does not accumulate any penalties, cannot be the basis for a criminal warrant, and can be satisfied by an hour or 2 hours of community service. So the idea is not, the fine is not the idea. The universal participation is the idea. And what's happened in Australia is that it's a minor annoyance for most people, and it's just become part of the culture over 100 years. Australia's had it since 1924.
It's a minor annoyance, but almost everybody seems to participate in Australia, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it has become part of the culture. And of course the analogy is to jury duty, which is in this country, for 100 years it's been mandatory for people to serve on juries if you get called. And if you don't get called, you get fined. And I have never heard anybody say, you may not want to go serve, but I've never heard anybody say, how dare they make me serve on a jury, because it's part of the culture. And we hope that voting can be viewed the same way.
Initially in the U.S., it would be mandatory in some places where states required it, but not mandatory in other states. Is that right?
Yes, that's
So
correct.
only some Americans would be required to vote.
Right, right.
There's a lot of stuff that's interesting in this book, and I thought one of the things is that it seems like the entire approach to voting in Australia is different from the approach that we have here in the States. There's almost a celebratory atmosphere. It's almost like a holiday. Talk about what Election Day is like.
Well, it's interesting. As I said, they do it on a Saturday.
Which we definitely should do here. I know
Yes.
the tradition is Tuesday, but we should do it on Saturday.
Absolutely. Election Day should be a holiday. And we should do all of the things that we call gateway reforms to allow people and encourage people to vote. Same-day voter registration, early voting, mail-in voting, lots and lots of things that you can do to make the whole system accessible. I think at that point, what the states would do would be to kind of pass the legislation that would define it individually for their state. And our recommendation is, as I said, a very small fine that easily is resolvable.
But the impression I got from reading the book is that it's not so much the idea that it's the law that people vote that makes Australia have such a high turnout compared to us, nearly universal turnout. I mean, it's kind of staggering to me. But it seems like it's kind of fun to vote. Their approach to it, the fact that there's this celebratory atmosphere, seems to make people want to participate. I think even if we passed a law in the United States, there still would be that difference.
Right.
We don't think of Election Day as something to celebrate. Is there anything we could do, anything we could learn from Australia that we might be able to import along those lines?
Yeah, well, they have created a celebratory civic culture. They really have. Over a long period of time, it has become that. One of the traditions, the honored traditions in Australia, is the democracy sausage. So that outside of every polling place, the local clubs or civic organizations set up booths and sell democracy sausages. They actually have a very standardized way to do it, which is a sausage, fried onions on the top, in a folded piece of white bread. Now, of course, in America, we would need vegan alternatives as well, which we would certainly recommend. But so they actually, given that you can vote in different places, people go online and go to Yelp and see where the best sausages are, and then they go vote there. So anyway, it's that's all part of it, and then people hang around the polling places.
And they have barbecues, I understand,
Yeah.
and things along those lines.
Yeah, no, it's very, very celebratory. And I would say that one of the things that is also true about universal voting is that it lowers the polarization level to some degree, because if everybody is voting and everybody is listening to the candidates, to the parties all the time, then you can't just appeal to your base, whether it's on the right or the left. You've got to appeal to everybody. And I think they do that in Australia, and it has lowered the temperature and made the culture better.
Why do we need universal voting here?
Well, we start with, and I hope frankly hope everyone starts with, the idea that higher levels of participation and more engagement by all of the citizens of our society is a good thing. So if you think it's a good thing, then you have to look at where do we stand. And 2018 was a record turnout year for a midterm election, and that was 50%. And in 2020, which was a feat given the COVID and given the 400 lawsuits and everything like that, but it was still 66%, and that was a record turnout.
That was incredible. Let me just interrupt you on that. I think it is so ironic that in the middle of the COVID pandemic, when everybody is frightened of this terrible disease and people are staying home from work, et cetera, you would think that voter participation would go down. And instead, it went up sharply.
Right.
What was going on, Miles?
Well, what happened was that the election officials, to whom I give extraordinary credit, we have a focus now on the fight over voter suppression versus voter expansion. But in general, the election officials did all kinds of things to make voting more possible. They lengthened the early voting days. They sent out absentee ballots. They had curbside voting, so you didn't have to get out of your car. I mean, they did lots and lots of things that encouraged people to vote, and people responded because they had different ways to vote, and they thought it was an important election. So that was extraordinary, but at the same time, the point I was making is that's really nothing to write home about. Even those record turnouts at 50 and 66% were well in the bottom half of industrialized democracies. So the question is, how do you, if you want to get that up so that you really do have universal participation or close to it, what do you do? And we've done all kinds of things to make voting easier, but this very simple way of just requiring it as a matter of civic duty ups the turnout by 25 and 30%. I think it's worth it.
One of the reasons we don't have higher participation, part of it is because a lot of people just don't go to the polls. But one of the reasons is there's been a sustained effort, primarily by the Republican Party, to prevent people from going to the polls. So talk about voter suppression. How widespread is it, and what are some of the forms it's been taking?
Right. Well, 2 points. One, there was for about 72 hours a celebration of how good the turnout was in 2020. And then, of course, it all devolved into the fight over whether the election had been stolen and, all of the big lie that Donald Trump purveyed. But also what's happened since then is that the country has sort of diverged, into two paths. There are lots of states, not only blue states, some purple states and some red states even, that have worked hard to make voting more accessible and more possible for people. And then in a number of states, especially where there has been kind of very conservative Republican control, a part of their agenda has been to make it harder for people to vote. And that's really a shame. So the things about having very strenuous ID requirements or shortening the days that people can vote or eliminating drop boxes, those are some of the things that have been passed in some states to make it harder for people to vote. That's really a shame and has to be fought, by the way. I mean, one of the things about the book is it assumes that we are marching forward toward a better democracy. Obviously, at the same time, we've got to fight off attempts to make to roll our democracy backward to the days where it was really hard for people to vote.
When voter suppression manifests itself as an attack on voter registration, how does this come about? What are the kinds of things that they do to prevent people from even registering?
Well, let me come at it through the positive first, which is that in many, many states, the opportunities for people to register have grown dramatically over the last 20 years. So when I was Secretary of the State in Connecticut, there were only 4 states that had same-day voter registration, and now there are 23. There were no states that did online voter registration. Now there are 40. So the registration opportunities have expanded. But in the places that they want to make it harder for people, what they've done is shorten the voter registration periods, refuse to adopt same-day registration. And one major area has been on the question of whether citizens who have been in prison for a felony conviction, when and how do they get their voting rights back? Now, some states, Vermont and Maine, never take away your right to vote. And Washington, D.C. now as well. But in other states, you have to make it either harder or easier for people to get their voting rights back. So in Florida, actually a constitutional amendment passed to make it very easy for people to get their voting rights back, and then it was undercut by the Florida legislature. So it's really distressing to see that kind of voter suppression activity, but what we want to do is both push it back, but also we see the universal voting as a kind of a North Star reform, to be out there to say, what is it that we really want to aspire to? It's not just to get 2 more days of early voting, it is to have participation be by everyone in our community.
So we have all kinds of problems with voting in the United States, with elections, and one of the big problems is extreme gerrymandering.
Well, gerrymandering is a what you call it, a hallowed part of American history.
Both parties have done it traditionally.
Yes, and gerrymandering is named after a governor of Massachusetts from 1792, Elbridge Gerry. But what's happened is, especially since 2010, when there was a real kind of wave election that brought in lots and lots of new and quite conservative Republicans, they drew the districts such as to try to ensure that Republicans would have major majorities. So in Pennsylvania, for example, which was one of the states with the worst gerrymandering, you know, the state is an absolute 50-50 state, but the Republican legislature drew the line so that it was a 10-3. And when the Speaker of the House was asked, how come you drew it so it was 10-3, he said, well, we couldn't figure out how to make it 11-2. So, you know, you can draw the lines for partisan advantage. There are, you know, you can't do it based on race, according to the old Supreme Court cases. But
you're not supposed to do it based on race.
Right. But they do, and they justify it as a partisan, which there is no rule against. So in many places, though, citizens have passed voter referendums, established independent redistricting commissions, gone to court and had the lines reversed. And so actually the post-2020 census was not nearly as gerrymandered as what happened in 2011. So again, a part of what I want to try to do is, if there's so much emphasis on all the things that people are doing that are negative, I want to try to point out that there is a real democracy movement. It is making progress. In a lot of states, things have gotten a lot better. And on the basis of that, I think we have something to build on to do universal voting.
We come at it somewhat differently, and I think it's probably because of my journalistic background. I do want to emphasize the negative somewhat more, because I think people don't understand really how terrible the things are that are going on. So when we talk about extreme gerrymandering, you have these states where the district maps are drawn in such a way that it doesn't, and you mentioned this in Pennsylvania, for example, but it doesn't matter how many votes, let's say, Democrats can get. They could never get a majority in the state legislature until we finally get these things redistricted. That's not democracy at all. If you had, you know, almost 100% turnout based on the way the districts are drawn, you'd have all the turnout of Democrats in small areas districted for Democrats, and all the rest where it sort of wouldn't matter what the vote was, it's going to go Republican. People need to understand this, and it needs to be explained to them clearly, and I think fought against even harder than what's going on now, even though I understand that a lot of people are working pretty hard at this.
No, that's right. And EJ and I in the book tried to make the point that we don't view universal voting, civic duty voting, as the elixir for everything that ails our democracy, right? In other words, this, in and of itself, universal voting would not change the gerrymandering problem. It would not change the wild over-influence of money in our political system. It wouldn't change the undemocratic nature of the Senate.
It wouldn't change the Electoral College.
It wouldn't change the Electoral College, right? But in the lane of participation, which I think is a major lane, because as people know, the power of people is the only antidote to the power of money and the power of politicians to undercut. If we had 80-90% participation, it would be a different ballgame.
I agree, and I think we also should point out, since I've been emphasizing the negative, that if you did have universal voting, you would eventually be able to undermine some of these things. You could pass laws that would ultimately get rid of extreme gerrymandering. You might eventually be able to do something about the Electoral College. I'm not sure about that, but that would be the only way you could do it, is if you could get a lot more Americans to participate in voting. One more thing along these lines. The most important piece of legislation passed in my lifetime was LBJ's 1965 Voting Rights Act. Right. In 2013, the Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, who I think has not paid a sufficient price for this evil thing that he did, they completely undermined the Voting Rights Act. They gutted it. Explain why that was such a devastating decision and why it was so wrong.
Well, yes, absolutely. It was a devastating decision and really wrong, and it has had all kinds of negative consequences. Basically, in that Shelby case in 2013, the minute the Supreme Court ruled that the states who had been under what they call pre-clearance, where Justice Department had to review any changes in election laws, that's when the floodgates opened, and laws to make it harder to vote just came barreling out of the legislatures all around the country. And when the pre-clearance was the strongest tool, now people can still sue if they feel that their voting rights have been violated, although that has also been narrowed by the current Supreme Court. So
and that's a long, difficult process, going through the courts one by one, each case, as opposed to pre-clearance.
Right, and it was a terrible failure of Congress over the last 2 years to not pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would have restored much of the power of the Voting Rights Act. Interestingly enough, though, there are now states who are passing state Voting Rights Act that mirror in ways the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act, actually acting on a state level in the absence of real federal action. And again, I'd use that analogy because I think that's the way universal voting will advance. Some municipalities, some states, generally states that already have good voting systems, will adopt it, and then hopefully it will spread around the country.
Along the lines of the positive things that are happening, in the 2020 election, when Donald Trump lost and the Republicans are screaming that the election was stolen and it was unfair and that sort of thing, there were state officials in many places in this country and a fair number of Republicans who were under extraordinary pressure,
absolutely,
who stood up and did the right thing, and not to mention all the court cases that were fought out as well. But they stood up and they did the right thing. They looked at the election results honestly, and they said, no, this is the case. This election was fine. There was no fraud here. Right. And they stood up in the face of all this pressure. Were you surprised by that? And talk a little bit about how important it was that occurred.
It was incredibly important because, had maybe 20 or 30 election officials buckled to what Donald Trump was trying to get them to do, Georgia, obviously, but in Pennsylvania, other places, we might have been in danger of having the election overturned and gone into a major constitutional crisis. But there is a level of professionalism and camaraderie, but most importantly, commitment to democracy that is very strong in the election community, the election administration community, for local officials, secretaries of the state, and city election officials. And it's been really, really, and one of the shames is that the harassment that they have received as a result of standing their ground is now forcing a lot of them to leave the field, which is a shame. So we need a new batch of really courageous election officials to come into the field.
Right now, according to the polling, a majority of Americans are not in favor of universal voting. Why do you think that's the case? And what are you guys doing to change people's minds?
Well, EJ and I like to say that we were either the most honest authors or the dumbest because we put a poll into the book that showed that initially, right now, 26% of Americans would support moving to universal voting. But 61% of people in the poll both Republicans and Democrats said that they viewed voting as both a right and a duty, and we think that's something to build on. So I think the real reason that it has such low popularity, no one has ever made a case for it before. This has been, even though it has been successful in 26 other democratic countries, it's been an absolute non-discussion here. So what we want to do, and we've created an organization called 100% Democracy, an initiative for universal voting, to take the idea of universal voting and move it out into states. So what we're doing is we're going to basically be organizing in a number of states over the next 2 or 3 years to try to get the idea out into the public domain, adopted by organizations that are in the democracy field, and hopefully moved forward or passed in state legislatures. So even this year, even though there has been so little so far, the state of Washington, a bill was submitted and passed by the Elections Committee, and in the state of Connecticut, 2 bills were submitted and had a public hearing. So that's the beginning. We see it expanding in 2024 and 2025.
Now, I've known you a long time, and you are the ultimate optimist. In our last 30 seconds, because I've talked to a lot of people who say, oh my God, everything is terrible right now, we're going down the tubes. I've had friends who say we're doomed when they look at the politics and stuff. Tell me, let's say you were facing a class of college students.
Yep.
Tell me what it is we have to be optimistic about. Why should we be optimistic at this moment in American history?
Well, I'll just talk about our democracy, which is that, yes, there is a movement to set us back, but at the same time, there is a growing and robust movement of people who are really interested in making our democracy work. The issues of democracy, which used to be marginal over here, are now front and center and being discussed. And if you look at the 2020 elections, the people who were most negative in terms of wanting our democracy to fail were rejected by the voters in state after state after state. So I think there is a fundamental support for our democratic norms and our democratic beliefs that I think we just need to build on over the years ahead.
So we're going to stop there on that optimistic note. We've been talking with Miles Rapoport. The book that he has written with E.J. Dionne is 100% Democracy, the Case for Universal Voting. Miles, thanks for talking with us. We appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.